Can I get an extra medium t-shirt or what?
Extra medium with extra wrinkles.
Embarrassment to this company.
My arms are so small now. My forearms are bigger than my biceps.
With a lovely tan though. Welcome back to Sika Strength and welcome back to Sika Stand. Today we're doing S&C coaches react to Akzhol Makhmudov, who is a Kyrgyzstani Greco-Roman wrestler. He won silver in the Tokyo Olympics, 2022 Greco-Roman wrestling world champion. So that was Kyrgyzstan's first ever world champion in Greco-Roman wrestling. And then he repeated again in 2023 where he won gold. He competes in the 77 kilo class. Now, interesting note, we've been to Kyrgyzstan and it is an unbelievably cool country. One of our friends nearly died of a fever there, but he didn't get that in Kyrgyzstan. He got that in Uzbekistan. And lovely people, very, very, very pretty countryside, amazing mountains. But today, when we're doing the S&C Coaches React, just before we get going, it is important to note that we are not making this for Akzhol to look at and be like, oh, this is what I need to do. My own S&C training, I think he's doing okay. This is for people who are doing wrestling or similar sports and want to find out some information when you don't have world-class training systems where you can't go to other countries and meet world-class coaches and train other great teams, and you don't have an institution of knowledge. You're training by yourself. You might have any S&C coach, you might have a bit of an S&C coach, you might have your coach might do a little bit of both, and you want to broaden your horizons. So we're here just to take some of his training footage and put a bit of context on what it might mean for you, but not necessarily what it means for Akzhol. So this isn't a hit piece or recommendation for him before anyone gets their little shoelaces all tied up and you get really mad at us. Sometimes when the videos get big enough, people are like, yeah, you think you know what he wants to do? Yeah, I don't think that's the case.
Yeah, view this as like basically a frame to view your own training within, or your own athlete's training within. This basically brings up topics for us that are good to discuss, good to delve into with some kind of real-time feedback or real-time application of these. Now, up first here, we see Akzhol training in the South Korean Training Center. Now, there's a few interesting pieces going on here, and there's a few conversation points that constantly pop up. So we see some kind of very aggressive barbell rows or barbell curls. We see some kipping or butterfly style pull-ups, and then we see some toes to bar with a lot of kind of swing or a lot of kip on them. Now, in all of these three things, we see something commonly referred to as body English. So using most of our muscles to move a barbell, that in many cases in a bodybuilding or hypertrophy setting, you want to be as strict as possible with. Now, for the athletes using these, it all comes down to the particular application. So if you're using these as part of a local muscular endurance training piece, where you're really looking to train that muscle to be able to contract multiple times over and over again against a certain amount of force, then the use of that body English is incredibly valuable. So let's take, for example, we have a wrestler in this case wanting to get better with their upper body muscular endurance. Those rounds are going on for multiple minutes. We have multiple rounds per fight. We have multiple fights per day at competition, and so having that endurance within those muscle tissues is really important. It's not all about just becoming as strong as possible with those muscle units. So when we're looking at this, we actually need quite high mitochondrial density within the cell. We need the cells to be good at dealing with both very fast and explosive movements that are mainly going to use ATP and creatine phosphate, but they also need to be quite good in that kind of glycolytic realm. So that realm where we're utilizing quite a lot of that glycogen that's built up within the liver and within the muscle themselves, and processing oxygen as we're going through those movements. Now, if we were to do the movements incredibly strict, then we're really not going to get too many reps done. We're also not going to be able to move a weight that's all that valuable to us in terms of producing a lot of force within the muscle, and probably more importantly than anything else, we're not going to be working for long enough to actually get any of that local muscular endurance effect. So imagine we're on those bicep curls with the barbell. If I was to just do it as heavy as possible and say load up 60, 70, 80 kilos with that, probably only get a rep or two in there. Now, if I was to do the opposite end of that and put 20 kilos on the bar, then I'll probably be doing that for 15 minutes without needing a rest. So in this case, we're looking to build that local muscular endurance. We're looking for that optimal zone, that kind of butter zone where we have nice loading on the barbell, so we're producing a lot of force, but also we're not going to be doing it for minutes upon minutes upon minutes and basically not producing any major force within the muscle. Up next then, we see some very interesting training. So as Garth mentioned earlier, Kyrgyzstan is an amazing country. There's a lot of it is these kind of big mountainscapes. And what we see here is the lads training with some kettlebells, with some rings of timber, with some old barbells, out in these non-ideal training circumstances. So this is a crazy kind of polar opposite to that South Korean training hall. And there's a few things going on here. Now, the first thing is just getting your conditioning work done in these environments is the most important thing. Ideally, if we were to do heavy squats, or maybe if we were to do very fast power cleans or snatches, we don't really want to be doing them in these outdoor environments because there's quite a lot of load on the barbell and because there's quite high risk to injury. Now, when we're doing these kind of conditioning movements, when we're using kettlebells, or in some cases here we're using a training partner as the weighted implement, there's a bit more margin for error. The weight isn't so heavy that we're very likely to get injured, and also we can drop the weights in these areas without having any sort of damage to the barbells, the plates, the kettlebells, or anything like that. Now, one thing we see commonly in wrestlers training is them using each other as their weighted implement. And there's a few reasons this works really well for the sport of wrestling. The first reason is that the sport of wrestling is basically about picking each other up and turning them around in the air and slamming them on the ground. Now, there's other sports where we see this commonly being used. Judo is an example, rugby is an example, where we'll use this as a conditioning piece. Now, it's interesting, we look at this, we see high reps, and we see the partner playing along with it. So the partner is manipulating his or her body to make sure they're in the correct position for the landing so they can get straight into the next rep again. So if you're using this in your training, it's very important that both partners understand what's going on here. I'm going to do 20 of these flips, then I'm going to swap with you and you're going to do 20 of these flips. We're not fighting the position. We're not fighting to kind of push against the grips or anything like that. No, what I'm doing here as a partner is I'm going to put myself into the best position possible, be that a very rigid plank-like position if we're just moving them around in a single plane, or maybe I'm actually holding on with my legs or my arms to make sure that the person can actually get the valuable reps done. Now, there's a skill element to this, both for the participant, but also for the weighted implement in this case. And it isn't something that a beginner is going to straight away pick up and be able to do. This is probably the second or third stage in this lifting that you'd see people doing. Commonly with the youth athletes, we'd get them one person standing stock upright, maybe one person jumps on their back and rolls around to the front and then climbs back around to the back again. There is a nice kind of entry level to these training pieces. The final thing to talk about here is the use of kettlebells. So kettlebells are something we're asked about on a very, very regular basis. Obviously, they're a great training tool. They're super compact. They're super portable. We can bring them wherever we want. And they have a very low barrier for entry. So we can get one or two kettlebells, get a lot of work done with our training, rather than having to have plates, a barbell, a squat rack, spotters for the squat rack, all of these different things. So the really common question we get is, can I just use kettlebells for my training? And the answer is no. So kettlebells are really good for the local muscular endurance piece. They're really good for some explosive work, and they're really good for our general aerobic conditioning. But most of the time, if we're looking for top end speed, top end power, or top end strength, the kettlebells just aren't going to be heavy enough to get us there. Or the more likely scenario is we're not going to be able to have enough kettlebells to get them heavy enough to have a valuable stimulus in that case.
Now, kettlebells might not get you there, but what will absolutely assist in that, especially for Greco-Roman wrestling, is the use of the Olympic lifts. So just first of all, I want you to bring your attention to a very specific lift here, which is a 105 kilo full snatch by this absolutely amazing athlete. And this 105 kilos, first of all, incredibly heavy weight. He's a 77 kilo lifter. We often talk about people using maybe 1.2 to 1.5 times body weight on the power clean. Obviously, the snatch is much harder and requires a lot more skill and mobility to complete a full snatch. And so if he's completing well in excess of his body weight here for 105 kilo snatch with exceptional technique, this is incredibly useful for the sport of wrestling. Now, there's a couple of benefits that we'd normally look for when we're using the Olympic lifts in sport. We're looking for power, we're looking for speed, contracting, relaxing really quickly between those. So we're going from a high contraction peak to a really relaxed state to contract again really quickly, which is very important for the vast majority of sports. Now, we don't normally like to look at a movement and think, how can I make this sport specific? But in this case, the incidental coincidence is the fact that the Olympic lifts are incredibly useful in a sport-specific manner for the sport of Greco-Roman wrestling, and that is picking up a heavy object and manipulating it around your body. It's not that we'd look for that in a movement, we wouldn't go, okay, we have to replicate the sport like we would be doing anything. We would never look to replicate our sport in the gym, but it just so happens that we've got an extra benefit when we're using the Olympic lifts is the fact that we're moving an object around our body and we're manipulating that object like you would with an opponent in wrestling. And this gives us a huge amount of benefits on top of the already mentioned benefits of Olympic lifting, which is speed, mobility. We're going for contracting and relaxing. So we're getting a variety of different benefits. But the astounding part for Akzhol is the fact that the quality of his technique is exceptional. Now, it's very likely in this case that Akzhol has gotten coaching from someone who knows what they're doing. This level of technique is far beyond what any amateur or even maybe an intermediate lifter would possess at similar weights in the sport of weightlifting. This is really a technique if someone's been coached by a professional athlete or a professional coach. Kyrgyzstan does have a weightlifting team and they are pretty competitive on the international scene. So I'd have to imagine, and I'd love to know, if he visited their national training centre and got some coaching. So we look at Akzhol doing the Olympic lifts. We've got full snatches, power cleans and some split jerks. So either one of these or any one of these variations are very, very useful. The full snatch, manipulating an object around your body center of mass, staying in balance, trying to move it fast into a position. You are being in control. The same with the clean. You're just moving it through a little bit of different range of motion, but you're manipulating that heavy object that's distal from your body away from you and then pulling it towards you and moving it to where you want it to go. Again, on top of those great benefits, we already talked about those attribute benefits from the Olympic lifts. And then finally, we've got the split jerk, which is quite interesting. The split jerk is something that is almost akin to a plyometric movement. Now, it follows similar principles to the snatch and the clean, but really what we're looking for is one big explosive push into a position, and it trains that attribute rather than this specific movement here. So we're going overhead. We're probably not going to go overhead too much in Greco-Roman wrestling. Maybe we're pulling someone in. Maybe we're going for that pretty insane suplex we see Akzhol use sometimes. But realistically, when we're using the split jerk, it can be used, but really we're looking for an attribute here. So I wouldn't put all of your eggs into a basket when you're using the Olympic lifts on the split jerk for wrestling, but you certainly could make use of that where we're contracting, relaxing, we're dipping and driving really aggressively with a fast push. And you can see he's doing in excess of his body weight there. So we're starting to make some very good use of that. The main issue we'll see with snatching and jerks, for example, for athletes is very often they don't have great mobility, but Akzhol has the mobility of an elite level weightlifter.
So speaking of that power, speaking of that kind of plyometric movement, up next we have some very impressive jumps. So it's interesting to see it again in this kind of outdoor setting, and people will often talk about, oh, my box jumps at the gym aren't great, or I'm jumping onto those foam plyo boxes and it's not ideal for landing on. In this case, we see rings of timber being used to land on, and there's probably some extra training that's coming along with that. So that extra stability work from landing on that slightly imperfect surface is probably no harm at all in a sport where you're literally being thrown through the air and having to constantly manipulate your body around that. Now, when we look at the jumps, it's interesting. We see both upper body and lower body plyometrics going on here. So we see the kind of deficit power burpee being used, a lot of upper body plyometric movement going on, and obviously some very, very high box jumps. Now, if you're doing the box jump for yourself, we always get the question of, am I better to jump straight on top of the box and land as high as possible, or should I be focusing on landing in the squat position? This all comes down to, what do you want to get from the box jump? So are you a thrower? Are you a rugby player? Are you somebody who wants to produce as much force as humanly possible? In that case, when we're doing the box jumps, we really want to be jumping as high as possible. And the marker for this is you want to be jumping so your midsection gets as high as possible. Imagine in the alternative case here, where I have a very high box in front of me, I do a small dip and drive and I basically pull my legs up into me and I land in a deep squat position. Now, this can be valuable for people like weightlifters who need to get into those positions. Also, they can be valuable in a fitness sport such as CrossFit or High Rocks, where you want to be as efficient as possible at getting onto the box. But in the athletic realms, and particularly the high power output realms, we want to be thinking about landing in a kind of quarter squat position. So I don't want to be landing fully straight legged, because it's not going to be the most stable position when I land. And especially in this case where you have rings of timber, or if it's a very foam and soft plyo box, then we want to be landing in that bit of a squat position, small bend in the knees, ankles and hips, just to make sure we're in an athletic position when we land and it's a nice stable landing position. Now, the other thing that comes in here is we see, and we're not quite sure if it's being used in a warm-up context, but we see some fundamental level plyometrics going on here. The simple 1 foot off the box, 1 foot on the box, or in this case 1 foot on the ring of timber, 1 foot off of it. This kind of stuff is often overlooked by the amateur athletes or by people who are coaching this kind of stuff themselves. So the starting point for plyometrics is just being able to land effectively. Now, a vital point of being able to land effectively is having very good agility with our feet. So it's about those small, fine motor units, being able to control where our feet are landing and having that timing down to an absolute T. This will help you get the most out of your plyometric training, but also massively limit that risk of injury that comes with jumping onto, or more importantly, falling off of a box.
So we've got two different clips here of Akzhol doing some steady state jogging, and we've got some hill sprints. Now, I think this is a really great opportunity to talk about how you could think about conditioning in two different fashions. So there's lots of very intricate ways of we can monitor conditioning. If we look at, for example, the Norwegian athletes, one of those athletes talks about monitoring their lactate threshold for every single run they do. So every 400 meter run he does or less, he measures his lactate threshold. Then we've 4 or 5 different zones of rate of perceived effort in our conditioning activities based on our heart rate activity. And then, of course, we've RPE, which was originally meant for conditioning before it was bastardized for strength training. But for you as an individual, if it's not quite clear what you need to do and you're not really sure how do you organize that, think about these as 2 different factors. You've got steady state, zone 2, which is just, you could do this all day. If you watch the jogging pace here, you could see him jogging a very casual pace. You'd almost call this a warm-up pace before he does more intense training. Have plenty of this throughout your training for most of the year until you're getting very close to competitions. You can do this from anywhere from 2 to 4 times a week, 2 to 3 times a week, and do this for a reasonable amount of time. Let how you feel dictate that, and then slowly increase that capacity. This should feel like, okay, I could talk to someone while I'm running. You could talk to your running partner while you're moving. You feel like you could keep this going for maybe an hour, 45 minutes without much effort. You'll be warm by the end of it. You'll be pretty sweaty. Your heart rate should be elevated. Maybe for a lot of people, this generally looks like somewhere around the region of maybe 110 to 130 beats per minute if you have a resting heart rate somewhere in the region of 60 to kind of 85 range. So if you're pretty fit, depending on your size, you'll elevate your heart rate into the triple digits, but it's nothing crazy. It's very easy to feel this. You should have plenty of this in your training throughout most of the year. So even if you're in the middle of a strength block or you're coming right up to a competition, you can keep a lot of this in, except for the couple of weeks away from it. The other style of conditioning you can do is similar to those hill sprints, or if you're wrestling currently, if you're doing jiu-jitsu or any grappling sports or judo, you'll know the one where it's incredibly intense. So we've got the steady state, and then we've got that really intense conditioning. We'll see him doing a lot of that intense conditioning, and Dara talked about this kind of in relation to, is it aerobic conditioning, is it local muscular endurance, when is it a combination of both of these, do we see segregations in those? But you don't particularly need to worry about that. You just need to worry about a style of conditioning which CrossFitters called fire breathing. Now, it's a little bit cringy, it's a little bit corny, but it is a good way of describing it, is that fire breathing conditioning or high intensity conditioning is very different from zone 2. And if you're doing Greco-Roman wrestling, if you're doing no-gi, if you're doing gi, judo, anything like that, you will know exactly what we're talking about. And that is also very important to have in your training. However, the load of that needs to be monitored as well. It can be something that you can do really intensely, but not quite do enough of in a session. So you can come in, push really hard for 30 seconds and not really hit the minimum required amount of volume that you need to do to get an improvement in that. So when we're doing these really high intensity conditioning sessions, which should be in your training for most of the year, but again, we'll see more of that as you come closer to competition. So if you're coming closer to your wrestling competitions, you want to increase the amount of fire breathing, high intensity conditioning you have and reduce a bit of that zone 2. And then when you're really far from competitions, you can have less of that high intensity conditioning and have a little bit more of that zone 2. But I'd recommend never really fully removing that from your training. You can take weeks off here or there. Maybe if you've had a big season, you can remove a couple of those sessions those high intensity sessions, you can strip back and you can say, okay, I'm going to take 2 or 3 weeks away from that and then return to them. But for most of the year, that zone 2 will be your base. And then as we get closer to competition, we'll increase the intensity, but also we'll try and increase the volume of our high intensity conditioning. So that might be hill sprints, but a huge benefit to this kind of grappling style training is machine work. So specifically something like the assault bike, maybe the ski erg, maybe a rower, maybe a bike erg, something where you can really control the intensity, you get visual metrics back towards you, and so you're not solely relying on how you feel. All that is important. You want to be increasing that wattage, that strokes per minute, the amount of calories burned, and going really intensely. But the important thing is that you're getting sufficient amounts of that high intensity per session. So again, like I say, you could come in, blast the assault bike for 30 seconds and then do no more for the session. And while you'll get some benefit to that, that's not really enough. So we need to be building on the volume of high intensity work you can do. For example, we'll sometimes have jiu-jitsu athletes frequently fighting somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes. And we'll do something not more akin to interval training where we'll do 5 seconds on or 20 seconds off, or we'll do 5 calories as fast as possible, rest for 15 seconds, or get as many calories in 5-second bursts in a 5-minute interval. So we look at our round timing and we somewhat try and match what kind of rhythm are we going to be looking for in Greco-Roman wrestling. But in wrestling, of course, it's probably just blasting for as hard as you can for most of the match. Whereas in gi jiu-jitsu, we're going really fast and we're relaxing for a few seconds, seeing where we are, and then we're going fast again, depending on how that match goes. Whereas, as anyone knows, lots of takedowns, lots of wrestling is something that requires a huge amount of conditioning. So you'll probably have to push that a little bit harder and it really drive up that VO2 max.
So the final thing we want to bring up then is body composition. So obviously professional athletes have everything going for them. They tend to be professional athletes because they're naturally genetically talented to be there, and they have that neural side of it that allows them to work incredibly hard. But when we look at amateur athletes, generally speaking, one of the main areas they fall down in is their body composition. So maybe it's not having enough muscle, maybe it's having too much fat, maybe it's being slightly out of the weight category they should be in, but generally speaking, we can all work a bit harder on our body composition. Whether you are a judo athlete, a wrestler, a weightlifter, or a powerlifter, you can be slightly leaner, you could have a bit more muscle, or you could be generally bigger or smaller and it'll be better for your sport. Now, an interesting side of this is the idea of periodizing your body weight over the course of multiple years of training. So a lot of us will think about there's an ideal body weight category for me to be in, particularly if I'm in a body weight sport, but generally we'll have this ideal number in our head. Maybe it's 5 kilos heavier, maybe it's 5 kilos lighter, maybe it's just where we are right now, but we want better body composition while we're there. Now, what I'd pose the idea of is that you probably shouldn't be the same weight all the time. If you're a wrestler and if in your off season you're 3 to 5 kilos heavier, then it is no big deal. This is the same whether it's wrestling, judo, jiu-jitsu, weightlifting, powerlifting. If you're in the off season and if we're pushing certain variables a bit harder, maybe this is more strength training, maybe this is more of a power focus, maybe this is more hypertrophy based stuff. In those off seasons, let's say if we sit 3 to 5% heavier than our weight class, this is no bad thing at all. This will actually allow you to have much better gains in the weight room, much better gains in terms of a technique, depending if you're doing a lot of technical work long away from competition and you have to do multiple rounds over and over and over again. Having that bit more body mass can actually aid you a lot in getting there. Now, that being said, when we go into our in-season piece, or as we begin to prep for a competition season, we should then be looking at our body weight as one of the factors we're going to change and one of those broad pieces we're gradually going to taper in and bring to a sharp point. So if I'm sitting at 100 kilos now and I want to fight at a 94 kilo weight class, well, that probably mightn't be a bad thing if I've 8 months to go before my first fight of the season. And for 4 months of those, I'm still going to be in a prep phase. In that case, being 100 kilos allow me to move heavier weights. It'll also allow me to move those weights faster. Might also allow me to train a bit more frequently throughout the week because those extra calories, that extra body mass will allow me to absorb some of that training volume easier. Now, with that being said, when we go to the in-season pieces and we start cutting down and leaning out, we need to be hyper-focused on not under-recovering. So a lot of the time people will try to do these manipulations in body mass or body composition very aggressively. They'll try to do it over a 6 to 8 week time period. Maybe they have a fight coming up and you say, okay, I'm actually going to drop down to the next body class or weight class down, and that's going to just restrict calories for those 6 to 8 weeks. Still going to train my ass off. Maybe I'll even be training harder because I want to drop those kilos faster. And in that case, we open ourselves up to a massive realm of repetitive strain type injuries. We also open ourselves up to stunted learning curves. So if I'm really trying to refine techniques, if I'm trying to bring some new things into my game, it can be difficult to do while we're in the cut. So when we look at our body mass and our composition, obviously in Akzhol's case here, we have a phenomenal specimen of a human being. This is what we'd all like to be like when we're in the competition season. But if you're not looking like that now and you're looking to make that change, make sure you have a longer term plan and you understand what those changes in composition and mass are going to mean for your off-season training, your in-season training, and your competition.
Lastly, we need to look at an aspect that is incredibly important for most sports, but none so as much as or as equal to as Greco-Roman wrestling. So the range of motion available to you, your flexibility, your mobility, your ability to move freely through different ranges of motion really quickly is incredibly important. And if we look at some of the stretching we see from Akzhol, we can see this picture here of him doing essentially a full pancake split, which is incredibly impressive. So we look at his physique, we look at his training, his conditioning, his precision, his skill development, his power, all of that available to him, and a lot of that is related to, or a basis of that, or important part of that is his range of motion, his flexibility, his mobility, whatever term you want to apply to it. Now, achieving this is quite difficult. It takes a lot of work. We've seen a little bit of a shift sometimes in the maybe somewhat derogatory take towards things that could get you there. For example, static stretching, demonized frequently on and off over the years. Soft tissue work in some sectors, specifically online, demonized pretty frequently over the years. But the one thing we've seen lots of different elite athletes across lots of different sports, and we'll see a lot of them, most Olympic teams will have a physical therapist specifically there to do soft tissue work before and after most training sessions. Most athletes in their free time before and after training are doing static stretching, mobility. Now, there's lots of different ways we can approach this problem and solve it. We could do exclusively soft tissue work. We could do exclusively static work. We do a combination. We can use massage guns, foam rollers, soft tissue balls. A lot of time, unfortunately, we see the people bringing the derogatory nature of increase your range of motion as people who don't particularly train very hard, who don't do sports like Greco-Roman wrestling. In these cases, it's incredibly important, and most of us could probably be a lot more flexible or increase our flexibility. We recently, for example, just held our strength conditioning camp and our weightlifting camp last week, and one of the big things we took people through was a frequent amount of soft tissue work. So as we started most sessions and we had the opportunity, we'd cool down with a little bit more soft tissue work. And the big thing you hear towards the end of the third or fourth days, people are like, whoa, I feel a lot better. And it's like, no shit, you feel a lot better. This stuff is incredibly useful. Their big thing when we look at what the effect of this is, or the argument against it, is that it's a placebo effect. But it's a misuse of the term placebo effect. If you look at it from the kind of physio side of things, they may refer to it as a prediction error in your body. Some people might argue that it's the Golgi tendon apparatus stuck in a particular position or stuck in a particular receptor position, and you might see people talking about adhesions or purely neurological. Whatever the physiological mechanism behind why your range of motion is restricted, we know that there's many ways that you can improve upon that. So whether that is mobility or soft tissue work, we know you can improve in it. And if you want to be the most powerful, supple, and feel the best, getting some of that, whatever method that you choose, into your sessions is going to be very, very useful. You want to feel free. You want to feel unrestricted. You don't want to be coming into a Greco-Roman match against Akzhol and feeling like your back is a little bit tight. You want to be able to rotate fast, aggressively, and freely. And if you look at the quality of movement, why Akzhol has just won the last 2 world championships. This is definitely part of his athleticism. So we've seen a big change for hybrid training. We've seen in the recent years, we've seen a lot of different people trying to get better at their sports, and we see people talking about why you shouldn't lift weights and why you should lift weights and different things like that. But one of the things when we're trying to be athletic in sports like this is having good range of motion, being flexible, but being really powerful in those range of motions. And like any other attribute, like your conditioning, like your strength training, like your plyometric ability or power ability, your mobility will not improve unless you train it. Now, you may genetically be more predisposed to having better mobility, but it won't stay, or it will slowly deteriorate to a certain level if you don't train it. And if you aren't on top of that, it deteriorates like any other skill. So you do need to be on top of it. And I've seen quite a few times now over the years where people don't realize how much better they do feel when they increase a little bit of this mobility or soft tissue work or whatever methods you choose, and how much better it feels for those training sessions. So you mightn't get a direct result on your 1RM back squat, but you might feel better every time you go snatching, and you might feel a little bit freer. And as we accumulate better quality sessions, we build up the momentum because we feel better every session, you end up getting better quality training. So don't discount the importance of being supple, to want of a better word, in your training. Now, if you'd like to improve your own training, you can check out the Sika Strength app on iOS and Android. Everyone gets a 7-day free trial. Just sign up to the app and cancel before the end of the 7 days. We've got a host of different programs that work incredibly well for wrestling. We've got our combat sports athlete program, which is specifically meant for athletes doing combat training. But if you want to push it to another level, we have our Becoming a Horse program. There's 2 blocks that on there that covers a lot of power training, a lot of the big lifts, a lot of hypertrophy work. There's also conditioning programs on the app, and so everyone gets 2 programs per month when you're using the app for the price of your subscription. So you get a lot available to you. Dynamic loading adjustment. There is a coach bot there which you can ask questions, which is a large language model bot which we are training all the time to give you better quality answers. Video library and access to our Facebook group as well. So check it out in the link below. It is something you won't regret for your own training.